Today's episode is brought to you by Baird Home. Baird Home LLP's integrated team of 97 attorneys licensed in 22 states is committed to connecting each of its valued clients to the positive outcomes they seek. With extensive and diverse expertise, we leverage each other's skills to respond efficiently to our clients' local, regional, national, and international legal needs. We are proud to represent public and private companies, individuals, private funds, and other investors, financial institutions, governmental entities, and nonprofit organizations. Hello, and welcome to the Booked on Planning podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rouse, transportation planner with the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Jennifer Hyatt, a land use and municipal practice attorney with Baird Home LLP in Omaha. We're here to get you hooked on planning through the books that have shaped the field. Let's dive in. Our guest today is Randall Arendt, a landscape planner, site designer, author, lecturer, and an advocate of conservation planning. He is Senior Conservation Advisor at the Natural Lands Trust in Media, Pennsylvania, and is the former Director of Planning and Research at the Center for Rural Massachusetts, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where he also served as an adjunct professor. Thank you for joining us today, Randall.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
All right, first question. Tell us just a little bit about yourself in your own words.
Okay. I've been involved in the planning field for about 50 years, and I had the very good fortune of doing my graduate work overseas in a parallel universe known as the United Kingdom. And I chose to do that for several reasons, but one of them was that since they've been building towns and cities for over 1,000 years, I thought that they probably knew as much or more about it than any place I could study here in the United States. What it turned out to be was that the most valuable part of that was living there. The studies were good, but the experience of living in planned communities like the new town of Edinburgh, planned in the 1750s, beautiful Georgian squares, terminal vistas, gardens and parks. It was very walkable in every sense of the word. Really made me understand what good planning could be. My childhood was divided between a town that had zoning but no planning. That would be Cranford, New Jersey. It was thoroughly zoned probably in the 30s or 40s. Our street was laid out in the 20s. It was a nice neighborhood. I could walk to the school, walk to shops, walk to church, walk to the town library. But there really was no open space unless I got into a car. My parents would drive me down to a floodplain park, very lovely park. But other than that, the town was just one subdivision after another after another. Fortunately, many of them built before World War II. Then when I was 9, I moved to a town that had no zoning, unlike Cranford, but had plenty of planning. And it was a master planned community in an unzoned township in northern New Jersey. And it was the reverse. You couldn't walk anywhere except to the open space. Lots of trails that would take me to ponds, down to the lake, to other neighborhoods. The trail system and the open space system was fantastic, but you had to get in your car to go absolutely anywhere. And it would be miles before you could get to the nearest shop or library or school. So the two parts of my childhood were like two complementary halves. And I spent most of my career trying to put the two together. And of course, when I lived in Edinburgh, I saw the two of them together. I saw the open space and the trails and the nature, as well as dense mixed-use development designed in a beautiful manner, as I said, with the terminal vistas and they had single-loaded streets with parks on one side and buildings on the other. So I was very fortunate. And I think that informed a lot of my career. And it's something that sadly most planners in this country haven't had that kind of mix of experiences. The other thing I'd say is that I've had the opportunity to rub shoulders for a long time with people with the design training, something that planning schools, even the ones in the UK, really don't have much of a design component. Since about the 1950s or 60s, planning courses in the United States have focused on anything but design. They focused on statistics, planning law, a little bit of engineering. So planners get out, they know about the importance of stormwater management, provision of workforce housing and affordable housing, prevention of water pollution, traffic flow, demographics. But there's not a single course in how to design a subdivision. And that was not the case before, say, 1955. So sadly, even all the professors now, two generations of professors at planning schools have come through a program that is devoid of design. Early on, the planning profession was filled with landscape architects and architects, and the courses at the colleges and universities did reflect that. And that's why I think you saw a lot of good planning in this country prior to World War II. Many of the new urbanists make that point time and time again. It's not the new urbanism, it's the old urbanism. It's the old urbanism of John Nolan, for instance. If you go back even further, landscape architects like Frederick Law Olmsted designed wonderful communities like Riverside, Illinois, to name just one of many. One thing that has really propelled me in my career is the desire to promote the idea of design. So every single one of the 7 books that I've written has got the word design in the title. And there's a lot of discussion and illustrations of design in it because I want to compensate for the deficiency in planning education. So that's really where I've spent my career, is to try to interject the idea of real physical design into plans and ordinances so that the results on the ground look nothing like the cookie cutter developments we had in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and still to this day. Go to most communities and it's the engineer that lays out a cookie cutter subdivision, and the planner is basically a code enforcer. He is a compliance officer. Planners are compliance officers. They look at plans done by other people and they tick the boxes to see if the street width is the correct, if the lot size is correct, if the frontage is correct, if the setbacks are correct. So that's what planners have become, sadly. Whereas if you go back a couple generations, planners were actually planning and it much more involved in design.
Yeah, you make a really good point. I had a very similar experience. I had literally one class out of an entire semester that taught us anything about, what a subdivision regulation was and how to lay out lots. So it was something that definitely just had to learn on the job. And it originally, just in my first position, was, like you said, checking the box. Does it meet these regulations? Yep, you're good to go. But I think a lot of departments are kind of recognizing what you've been speaking to and trying to help create better subdivisions, work with developers to rearrange lots and take advantage of natural topography and making better connections. So I think the work you've done is having an impact.
The Planning Accreditation Board, which basically accredits the planning courses, would seriously address this and say, we'll give you 5 years, but within 5 years, we want to see a lot more emphasis on design in your curriculum. There are places like Ball State University and University of California, the San Luis Obispo campus, that have great design components, but they're the minority. And I taught at UMass in Amherst. It was called the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning, but it was almost like the Great Wall of China between the landscape architecture curriculum and the planning curriculum. They just happened to co-inhabit the same building, but very little crossover in terms of the professors and the courses. And when they did a joint studio, the planners were the ones that did all the charts, and the landscape architects are the ones that did all the design. So there was no, I think there should be mandatory cross-dressing, if you will. So the planners get dressed up in the landscape architects, kind of mindset, and the landscape architects adopt the planner's mindset, at least for the studio projects, so that they could learn more from each other rather than continue to operate in their parallel silos, which is what sadly happens.
I agree. I'm a land use attorney with a planning background, and I only took one design class. Even my studio didn't have a design component with it. It was a full comprehensive plan. In my first job, I agree that I was just a code enforcement officer. This is a law, and this is how you apply it, which is why I wanted to read Rural by Design, given my rural background and lack of design experience. I read both editions. The first came out in 1994 and the second in 2017. Besides technology, what has changed that prompted you to write an update?
There was about a 25-year gap, and there are a lot of things that happened in between that needed to be addressed. TDRs did exist as a concept back in 1994, but one person said that if you covered the earth with all the sheets of paper that had been written about TDRs, you'd cover more ground than TDRs actually had saved, because there's just a lot of discussion, but very little action. Well, in the subsequent 25 years, there was a lot of implementation. So I wanted to put that into the book. The whole idea of stormwater management shifted from simply let's put the stormwater into a hole to let's recharge the aquifer and replenish the aquifer. And affordable housing took several leaps forward. So there are a number of issues. The new urbanism was not discussed in the 1994 book because it was still in its sort of infantile stages. Very good developments done before 1994, but few and far between. And in fact, I wrote the book in 1991. It just came out in 1994. So there was a great need. And by the time I finished kind of laying out the new edition, I saw that there was only going to be about 20% overlap. So the new book is 80% new material, which a lot of people, when a new book came out, they said, oh, we all have that book. It's called Rural by Design. We bought that decades ago. And sadly, a lot of people didn't look beyond the cover to see that it's a whole new book inside. And in fact, I asked the APA, I don't want to call it Rural by Design 2.0. I wanted to call Community by Design. And they said, oh, sorry, somebody already took that title. And besides, Rural by Design is a brand. Well, it's a misnomer too, because looking at the book, I mean, a lot of case studies are not rural, they're a small town, or they include big places. Omaha, for instance, has got this tremendous trail system that I didn't know about till I visited Omaha maybe 10 years ago. And I said, this is good stuff, got to put it in the book. Even though Omaha is a huge city, any community can learn from the Omaha trail system based upon their sewer plan, which is a funny place to begin, but actually very logical, because sewers go out there ahead of development and they are linear landforms, and you can make trails on top of the sewers. So it made great sense. And Rural by Design, as I say, is a misnomer. And I just wish more urban planners and town planners would say, oh, this is a book that contains a lot of relevance to them. I lived in Amherst while I wrote the first book, and hence the title. And Amherst is a town of like 20,000 people when you consider the students. And it wasn't rural, but they had a rural character because 30 years before, there were more cows than people in Amherst. And there's still a lot of, former dairy farms that were kind of pastures, depopulated pastures. And it had a rural feel. But if true rural is probably a small town in the middle of South Dakota. But I didn't want to write a book for the typical rural town in the middle of South Dakota or the middle of, Iowa, because nothing's happening in terms of development. The development pressure is happening within 50 miles of big cities. And there are a lot of small towns that are formerly rural that continue to think of themselves as rural, but they're suburbanizing. And that was my market audience. The places where things were happening, where planning boards needed to deal with applications for subdivisions and shopping centers and office parks. And sadly, we're seeing very few proposals for workforce housing or developments that were creatively designed. It was that kind of rural area. You might call it the metropolitan fringe, or the edge rural areas around the outskirts of these metropolitan regions.
I see. And to that end, where communities were getting applications and applications, one of my favorite stories was when a group of people got together when they found out that their subdivision regulations were being updated, and went out and measured street distances and setbacks and documented the quality of the community and took that information to their planning commission. It was an amazing story, but that one was led by one person in the community. It made me think about how Euclidean zoning has made homogeneous pockets within communities, and wonder about how can we train planners to find those people and work with them to rethink development within their communities.
Yeah, there was Honeoye Falls in upstate New York, a suburb of Rochester, sweet little 19th century town. I made a big point in that chapter. It was within the first 4 chapters, maybe chapter 3 of the book, as I recall. And I think I put it into the new edition as well. There's this huge disconnect between the community form that people like and the community form that is being built according to code. And they found that the streets were far too wide, the minimum street frontage was far too wide, the lot size was far too large, and you could not build a nice, walkable 19th century kind of community. New urbanists were quick to pick up on that, and they did much the same thing. Duane drove around small towns in southeastern US with the developer of Seaside, and they absorbed by osmosis and sketchbooks the characteristics of these traditional communities, and they put that into their new urban codes. So one message to planners is to really look at the parts of the community that people cherish, and they will typically be the ones built before World War II. Then go out there and measure that and observe, what are the juxtapositions? Do we have small lots next to larger lots? Do we have single family next to 2 family, next to 3 family, or maybe there's a 4 family there? Are there some home businesses that are really more than just something which is invisible to the street, but actually, along the street, there might be a barber shop, or there might be a small grocery store, corner store. There might be a dentist. Where I live in Brunswick, Maine, in the older parts, you will find mixed residential streets where there is a dentist, there is an engineer's office, cheek by jowl with another house. Typically, they are older homes that have been converted to non-residential uses, but they sit comfortably with the remaining residential uses, which are still on the street. So, there was a graphic in at least the first edition, perhaps the second one, done by Stephen Moore, an architect who used to live in Brunswick, and he drew a drawing of his street, and he found that there were something like 30 people to the acre, but it was just a typical street in a 19th century neighborhood of single family lots. But the homes were fairly large on single family lots, and some of those homes had accessory apartments. And you could see how ridiculous it is to think of, the type of zoning we have today, which is limiting everything to single family residential in vast parts of the community, and making the lots too wide and too large to have that walkability. So designs that Stephen Moore did as an architect to show what was done before zoning in Brunswick, Maine, could inform the way that zoning is revised so that we repeat the successes of the past, basically prior to World War II, and consciously avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, typically post-war.
Yes, I have to admit that graphic really caught my attention. Even in Lincoln and Omaha, I'm not sure you see 30 people that close together. What can planners do to encourage communities they work with to be more open-minded and flexible with developers and development, and consider these higher density options moving forward? With most of the regulations, the best we are seeing is getting rid of single family districts and maybe allowing 1 accessory dwelling unit. Do you have a better approach?
Well, it really begins with, I think, the education and exposure of planning board or planning commission members to these ideas, which is why I pitched every single book to that kind of audience, and also the planning student audience. When I want to communicate to planning board members, I've got to not be terribly technical, because they might be bankers, or they might be grocers, or they might be shopkeepers. They could be professors of anthropology, but they know very little about town planning or engineering or architecture or landscape architecture. So I try to make it very non-technical. Fill it with pictures. If I could wave a magic wand, I'd put a copy of Rural by Design, among other titles, into the hands of every single planning commission in the country. There are 900 color images in the book, deliberately, because people will flip through the book and the images will grab them. And then they'll go to the caption. And my captions are always a couple of sentences long, so that I develop an idea quickly and hopefully hook them on reading into the text. And then as they read into the text, they get more educated. But they can learn an awful lot simply by flipping through the book and reading the captions. I would hope that every kind of regional planning commission, that's where I began my job in the United States after working in Britain. My first job was with the Southern Maine Regional Planning Commission, and we had annual workshops for planning board members, which would expose them to new ideas. That they would not get by just attending their planning board meetings faithfully every second Thursday of the month, looking at subdivisions and comparing it with the subdivision regulations. They don't learn anything. They're simply code compliance officers at that point. So we had this opportunity once a year to put on slideshows, and that's where I began doing this stuff. It was the beginning of an outreach process. And it began with one slide projector and one screen. And then I went to a planning workshop over in New Hampshire one time, and I saw this wonderful presentation done by an architect planner named Duncan McGowan. 2 projectors, 2 screens side by side, so you could show before and after, good and bad. And for years, I developed this double carousel slideshow ideas and put that into the books too, so people can have direct comparisons of how it looks one way versus another. But people are visual. So planning board members, I would hope, would be given the opportunity to attend annual seminars and workshops in their own county. So they don't have to travel to a national conference or to a state conference that costs a lot of money and multi-day kind of planning thing. And bring out those new ideas. And any planner that wants to have a JPEG image from the book, I'm happy to send people JPEG images from the book so they can put it into the presentations that they make, hopefully on an annual basis or more frequently. It's the planners at the regional level that I think stand the best chance of being the connectors between ideas developed at the national level by the new urbanists or other people like myself, and the local officials that have zero training. They just get appointed to the planning board because they raised their hand at a meeting one time saying, I'll serve on the planning board. Okay, you're on. And no training.
Yeah, you make a really good point there. A lot of times in some of our regional or local planning commissions, we have requirements. We need an architect, we need a lawyer, we need someone with development experience, and we just kind of leave it at that one person's going to represent that one field in making these big decisions for our community. And we forget that it would be very beneficial to have these annual trainings so everyone gets the same message and can take from it what they learn and apply it then the following year with all of their meetings. So that's a very good point.
Yeah. People sometimes ask me what I do for a living, and I say adult education. And they say, do you teach English as a foreign language to immigrants or something like that? I say, no, I teach, planning to planning board members. And essentially that's the nutshell of my career. I've been teaching planning and design to planning board members.
In that educational vein, one of the things I learned from reading your book, and I think would be beneficial for other people to hear about, is a conservation subdivision. It seems similar to what was used in the field of St. Croix's study. Can you share what a conservation subdevelopment is and how the community benefited?
Okay, conservation subdivision can exist at many different levels, but mostly it was a rural construct, rural suburban, where you're dealing with a part of the town township that has no public sewer. So you're dealing with septic systems or some type of community system. In Fields of St. Croix, they used a constructed wetland system, but more frequently it's spray or drip irrigation with the lagoons and the spray system. Golf course developers use that to irrigate their golf courses, but you could use it to be sprayed on pastures and meadows or into woodlands. So it was kind of a rural construct, and Fields of St. Croix was essentially designed by a developer on the Urban Land Institute board named Robert Engstrom. And he had this great interest in native plants and native species. So we put a little nursery of native plants into his development and used that to get plant material to landscape the development. But it was more than just, putting native plants around houses. It was designing the development so that there would be the majority of land, the majority of buildable land would remain environmentally intact, either as farmland or as habitat. It's a great example. It's within the Twin Cities metroplex, probably a half an hour drive from downtown St. Paul. And I liked it because it accomplished a lot. And it had a community-supported agriculture operation there for years. One thing that most conservation subdivisions don't have, and I wish they did, was some type of commercial component. In the absence of that, he took a barn and made it into a community center on the Fields of St. Croix, but it does not have a commercial component. A few of them do, and I think those are the ones that are really the best, but not every property lends itself to having that kind of mixed use. It's just maybe too far out in the sticks. Bob Engstrom was the one that coined the phrase twice green, meaning green environmentally, but also green economically. And as a board member at the Urban Land Institute, he had a lot of credibility in the development community. So when he said that he makes money from this, other developers, pay attention.
I thought that was a really interesting case study and thought about it in connection with Nebraska, where we require 3 acres in a rural subdivision for a septic tank and 1 house. It sparked my imagination for more densely populated subdivisions. One of the other things I've seen in rural planning is terrible street designs, wide streets, streets that go nowhere. In both books, you have a whole chapter dedicated to street design. What do you think is the community's biggest problem when it comes to street design?
Street design is typically driven by a mistaken notion of how to make them safe. And wide streets are seen as being safe streets because people won't bump into each other. Narrow streets turn out to be the safest, particularly if there's a car park on one lane, essentially blocking it so that 2 vehicles approaching each other with a parked car in one lane, one of those 2 vehicles slows down. It's traffic calming. It works really, really well on, many streets. Now, if it's a collector street, you can't do that. Collector streets should have free flow. But do the collector streets need to have parking on both sides, on-street parking? The answer is typically no, unless you're at a density of maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 dwellings to the acre with very little on-lot parking. But if everyone's got a 2-car garage and a wide driveway going up to the 2-car garage, they got plenty of off-street parking. And even, a minor collector could be 20 feet wide, meaning no parking lanes, except for the, if a person occasionally wants to park in the street, that wouldn't be a problem, but it wouldn't be a general parking in the street situation with a 20-foot wide street. But a 20-foot wide street is 2 10-foot travel lanes. On the interstate, if you measure the travel lane width in an interstate, it's about 10 or 11 feet wide. So we're building, interstate travel lane widths through our suburban neighborhoods. And we're not requiring that there be curves to the road and T intersections where people have to actually stop and turn to the right or the left before they proceed. If there's a lot of traffic calming that can be done by putting in more T intersections, or you can actually do a type of neighborhood green where you come in one side and it comes to a T, or you come into the other side and it comes into a T, but in the middle is this little village green. But it is a traffic calming device, which adds a little bit of grace and beauty to the design. When planning board members listen to engineers, they make their streets wide and they often don't put in the sidewalks. So I exhort planning board members to address this with common sense rather than believe everything the engineer says, because the engineer often misses the point. And the point is that in order to be safe, a street could be complete. That was another chapter in the new book, Complete Streets. And it means that you should never build a street that doesn't have a sidewalk on at least one side, unless it's a very short cul-de-sac, and then you can walk down that without, being in danger. But rather than having so much pavement being done between the curbs, let's move the curbs closer together and put some of that pavement on the other side of the curb as a place where kids can walk, they can pull their wagons, they can go on their tricycles, parents can push baby carriages, seniors can walk, people of any age can walk their dogs rather than walking in the street. Because I've seen so many subdivisions where the streets are 30 feet wide between the curbs and there are no sidewalks. I mean, what are they thinking? The answer to that is they were not thinking. They were simply they were being compliance enforcement officers. They were looking at the book that says you have to have 30-foot wide pavement between the curbs and sidewalks are not required. And unless planning board members read a book like mine or by others who make the same points, they'll never learn that what they're doing is destructive. They're spending town money eventually to repave that street, and it's an unsafe design. It's unsafe at any speed. It's dangerous by design, and that's a phrase that I borrow from somebody else, but I put in that Complete Street Standards. So some engineers really understand this and they embrace complete streets, but other engineers haven't gone to their professional training recently and haven't really learned what's been currently discussed over the past 15 years.
How can we get a community to focus on maintaining their downtown or civic center instead of focusing on highway development, which has become normal in rural zoning?
The first thing they need to do is to stop zoning the highway land for commercial development. Very difficult to do if they've already zoned it that way. But if they haven't, they should exercise extreme restraint, because the more they zone the highway, the easier it's going to be for the investment to go out there rather than doing infill or redevelopment downtown at higher densities with mixed uses. In the book, in the highway chapter, is an example of a community actually down zoning a rural highway. But it was lucky that I got there at a time when the excess commercial zoning land was not under pressure. It was York, Maine, back in 40 years ago. And I was able to work with the planning board, work with the landowners, say, we're going to take your land out of a commercial zone along Route 1, US Route 1, and zone it for limited commercial, not general commercial. Limited commercial would be a sit-down restaurant, a bed and breakfast, a rural use like a veterinary clinic or a kennel, a lumber yard, but very restricted. And the majority of Route 1 in York, Maine was downzoned because it had been inappropriately zoned for general commercial way ahead of its time. So fortunately, I didn't have a lot of landowners saying, no, we have plans to bring in a Walmart here or a Home Depot, because that just wasn't happening. But we shrunk the commercial district down to a very small area. And then we had design standards. And this is back in 1981. And I took my first stab at design standards. But a few years later, left the state of Maine for economic reasons and didn't come back until I was retirement age. And then I went back to York and went down Route 1 just to see what had happened in the last several decades. And I was really impressed with the design of the new commercial development. So I called up the town planner, Steve Burns. I said, Steve, I want to see your codes, because you must have good codes here on the design issue. I wrote some really, like a first stab at it back in 81. And he said, we haven't updated our codes since 1981. So even the most, basic design standards can make a whale of a difference. It's with regard to the maximum front setback, where the parking goes, having the street trees, in the front. It makes all the difference. Simple little things like that.
All right. To wrap up today's conversation, what would you say is the most important thing listeners should take away from your book?
Keep it by your side. Get a copy of it, keep it by your side, and look at it frequently, because it's a visual, treat to just flip through the pictures. There are 900 of them in Technicolor, and then read the captions and get into the chapters, and look at my website. There are a lot of free downloadable articles at greenerprospects.com. I'm not a very mercenary commercial type of person, and I put a lot of stuff out there for free. And when I sell the books, I sell them basically at a very, very small increase over the author's price, so I can undercut Amazon easily, because I'm not a commercial vendor. So if people want a copy of Rural by Design, they should go to greenerprospects.com and look how to get it at a discount price from me, because I don't believe in the price that the publishers are charging. I'm not saying it's wrong, but my belief system is get the information out there as inexpensively as possible.
Right, you heard it from the author. Head to greenerprospects.com to check out the resources that Randall has made available and get a copy of the book. Even if you've read the original, as we've learned today, the second edition has a lot more information that the first book didn't take into account. So I'd encourage you all to go out and get a copy. And I just want to really express our gratitude and say thanks, Randall, for joining us today on this podcast and being our first guest for Booked on Planning.
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be the first one. And if you would like an encore at some point, just let me know. I'm happy to participate.
Will do. Thanks.